welcome. Let's talk about self-delusion. We've all been there. We tell ourselves that something is when we know it isn't, or we tell it isn't when it clearly is what it is. There is a gruesome form of torture that was practiced by ancient imperial China known as death by 1,000 cuts. Death by 1,000 cuts is an idiomatic expression. Well, no, actually, death by 1,000 cuts was literal, but death by 1,000 paper cuts is an idiomatic expression that refers to a cumulative negative impact of numerous sort of minor injuries that you likely self-inflicted in the process of self-delusion. Now, you're a leader, and maybe even you're a servant leader, but maybe secretly you're kind of running on empty. Well, as an established leader, you may have even be in that sort of second season of your life, and you might be re-examining your priorities. But is it time to transform your leadership from servitude to service? I'll explain. But what I want you to gather here is, in case you don't know what that would look like, as a dedicated leader, you naturally strive to resolve the challenges of others. But in order to do so, are you practicing self-delusion? Now, you may want to push back, I understand that. And while your commitment to being a servant leader is admirable, it's critical to recognize that thin line between being helpful and being completely overwhelmed. Now, stay with me, because if you want to avoid death by 1,000 paper cuts, you're going to love the next 2 episodes of the Dov Barron Show. So stay tuned as we step into the leadership style that preserves your strength and your spirit, because that's where we're going in the next 2 episodes with my guest, Brent Perkins. All right, welcome to the Dov Barron Show. Come for the stories, stay for the learning. Join the movement of deeply curious learners by hitting the subscribe button now. The Dov Barron Show, it's not just another podcast, it's your passport to unparalleled insights. Each episode features the wisdom of global leaders, scientists, entertainers, entrepreneurs, philosophers, theologians, and journalists. We get inside of the most powerful minds in the most insightful possible way. From astronauts who've traveled the vastness of space to presidential candidates who are trying to make sense of the world that seems to be on the brink. The next 2 episodes with our special guest stories are going to incite and captivate you. Hit the subscribe button and become part of the global community today. Our guest for the next 2 episodes is Brent Perkins. He is a serial entrepreneur who has scaled multiple companies to over 8 figures. He's achieved the Inc. 5000 list status and yet found himself empty and depleted. After decades-long exploration of feeling that disconnect and not being enough, he wrote a book, and the book is titled Paper Cuts: The Art of Self Delusion. In 2022, Brent founded 3X Bold with the mission to help others prioritize themselves first in order to live bold, unleashing the curious, authentic, and wild self that lives within each of us. Ladies and gentlemen, turn up the volume and help me to welcome Mr. Brent Perkins. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Such a good day.
Good to have you here, mate. You know, I've enjoyed our previous conversations. We play in a lot of the same sandpits, but coming at it maybe from different points of view, but definitely there to serve leaders, finding out who they are beyond the superficial, if you will. But I think that oftentimes, particularly for us in leadership who've achieved a lot, we tend to get caught in these titles of who we are, and we tend to refer to ourselves as those titles. And one of the things that I see most missing in our society today is context. And what I mean by context is, how does this become that? What is the relevance to this? People make these nasty comments about, oh, you said that. Yeah, but the context is completely different. And it's also, well, you're that. Well, what's the context? As you know, my work is based in the emotional source code, and the emotional source code is the context of our lives. So what is the context of your life that got you to be the guy you've become?
Yeah, my entire life chasing success, being an entrepreneur, starting businesses, sitting in that CEO role for a decade. It really all started watching my dad do the same thing. Build companies, really achieve financial success, and at the same time was vacant from the home most of the time, at least mentally, if not physically. And so my mom made me her little helper. So very early on, everything I was doing was either to watch my dad achieve success and chase that kind of in my studies and who I wanted to be as I was growing up, and getting my self-worth from doing things that my mom needed done around the house, filling that void that my dad left by chasing his entrepreneurial self. So I was always doing things to be not only successful, but to fill that void in my heart and my soul.
So you became a human doing.
Of course.
And that's because that was what was modeled from your dad? You saw that. So was that what you believed it was to be a man at that point?
I don't know how I could have seen anything else. I felt like I was the provider. I was the one who had to bring in all of the resources, time, freedom, money, all the pieces, and fill that void in my partner and my own kids' life. And lo and behold, was I mistaken?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? It's really fascinating how we just follow the model. And why wouldn't we? When you think about it, as I always say to people, you have to remember that when you were a kid, your mom and dad were the god and goddess of reality. And they couldn't possibly be doing it wrong, so you do what they do, of course. And then you wake up one day and you look over at your kids and you realize, oh, my kids have no idea who I am. Aside from being a bank account who's not available, it's like, shit, I didn't want that. So that's an interesting piece for you, because what I really want to look at is what was the turning point in your life, in your leadership philosophy, in your business philosophy, because you don't live in that world anymore.
It was a culmination of things for me. I was married 18 years and ended up getting a divorce about 2.5 years ago. And while that wasn't the turning point, it was all leading up to this place where the businesses didn't have the level of internal success that even the external pieces sometimes had, right? There's so much control and gripping on tight. And I felt it not only physically, my mental health, my physical health, my emotional health was all going straight down the tubes. Every year it took so much more out of me to maintain. And I found myself physically present, not really there for my kids. I mean, not in a way where I saw them. It was more like trying to control who they became, what sports they played, how they showed up, what were their grades, but not seeing them. And all of this coming together where I'd also built this construct for my marriage. And I had placed my wife in a position where she only knew me as this provider because that's what I said I was.
That's such a great insight, because you sold somebody who you are and they sell it back to you. So don't bitch and moan, because you're the one who sold this to them. And if it's not working, the only person who can change that is you. But if you change it, you will come up against resistance of everybody who bought into it. The wife, it could be the husband, but says, I want you to change. But when you do, I'm not really happy with that because I bought into the other one. I just want the other version, but with some of the shiny bits that I like and not some of the shitty bits. It's fascinating. So you had this awakening, like you said, 2.5 years ago, you got a divorce, but it was before that you had this awakening. Is there something that kind of brought it on for you? Because I feel like there's a lot of leaders who are going to be listening to us who are going to say, I kind of think I'm in that, but maybe I'm not really in it. They're having those doubts. Did you go through that? Does the guillotine drop and then you go, oh, this is it? Or is it accumulative?
I've heard lots of people's stories and it's different for everybody. Mine was a little bit more cumulative in that regard, where I had just finished a 7-year stint with a company, sitting in the CEO role for 5 years, successful, traveled the world, went to 37 countries, was having fun, and yet was fairly unpresent for my family. And just felt this friction and this, I knew I had to make a change, but I didn't have any idea what that meant. I thought it just meant jump companies.
Right.
So I did that, went all in for a year, and then realized, ooh, this is no different.
Right.
Different people, different partners, different equity, same exact grind. And so it really set me down just doing the soul searching. And this is where I started to disrupt things. And you're right. People in my life went, what are you doing? Wait a minute. You're not who you've always been. What's happening? And it wasn't always in the healthiest way because I didn't know myself and I was questioning things. And I showed up in ways that was unhealthy because I didn't know either. It was new for me too.
That's a really important point. One of my sayings is that enlightenment is a destructive process. And people go, what do you mean? You have this picture of enlightenment as this monk sat on a rock on top of a mountain and he's, and there's light coming from the sky. But the truth of the matter is that when you become enlightened, which means you get light on your own life, you get some from their own shadows and you start to see some of the things, it is a completely destructive process. It will tear everything down, including the stuff you like, in order for you to rebuild. You can't kind of half-ass it. It's going to happen. And I think that that's what makes a lot of people afraid. Now, you and I both work with high-level executives, and we're helping these people Talk to me about the resistance of those people who go, yeah, I don't mind getting into my ankles, maybe even to my knees, but I'm not diving in here. I want to change, but not too much.
It's every single person, including myself. And I think it's easiest to speak to my own journey in that in this last 2.5 years, maybe 3 years ago, I knew I was relearning this stuff. I was trying on these new feelings and stepping into this quote enlightenment path. And I was probably drinking the most I've ever drank in my life. I was doing other destructive things because it all felt so abnormal. It was out of my routine. It was out of who I was. And I chose to do these other numbing things to just make it okay because it was so difficult. It was so different. I didn't have support of my long-term family and friends because they just are going, what's happening? So I had to actually get worse before it got better. And that's not a path everybody wants to take.
I think that most people would push back on that and say, I'm not interested in taking that path. I know that when I'm working with those people, they'll often say, well, does this mean that my whole life will go to shit? And my answer is, well, it's going to feel that way for sure for a while. It's not. It's actually going to get a hell of a lot, not better, but different. It's going to get a lot different. And that's really important. But our ego clings to what's familiar. So when you wrote the book, as I talked about, is paper cuts, and there's this Art of Self Delusion. Tell us what you mean by that.
I didn't know what I meant when I first stepped into this. This book kind of came to me in meditation as I felt called to step out of that second tenure of being a CEO for 5 years. And as I rejected it, I said, no, I don't want to write a book. It's not me. It came through, which is, here's your title. You're going to do this. And I learned it was part of my journey. It turns out it was a significant part of my journey to really learn how to put myself first, to do this thing you and I were talking about, which we can get into, called detached connection. And to learn that it's the stories we tell ourselves. It's this, we construct all of our experiences in life. It's fully determined by us. And this is a perspective conversation. It really is. And the paper cuts are how we choose to say that our conversation over here happened, or how our relationship over here is going, or maybe the world's happening to me over here, but by me here and for me here. We have this confusion that we're not actually able to retain personal agency. So if the book was summed up, it's about how do you retain personal agency all the time, at all levels? How can you have the worst possible thing happen to you and go, where's the lesson here? What positive thing can I take from this? How can I pay this forward in my life? You have that choice.
And I do want to get to that, but I want to also push back from the listener's point of view, which is, I can clearly remember a client of mine saying this to me. He's now one of my biggest promoters, I might say, a surgeon out of the UK. And his response was, I don't want any of this West Coast bullshit, this positive thinking. What's the good in this? And where's the lesson in this? How do you confront that? Because you've got to deal with that too. Because for me, it's anything but positive thinking. But I understand that from that point of view, it seems that way.
I don't look at it as some rose-colored glasses, positive woo-woo, everything's magically perfect. I know it sounds like that. I think the alternative way to look at this, and arguably the outcome is the same, is that every time we feel something is just stabbing us in the back or piercing us in the heart or just hurting, like weighing on us, it never hurts, as you stated at the beginning here, to get curious and say, even though I may not believe this and it may be complete bullshit, I'm curious. What would the flip side of this be? What if it wasn't true? And what's interesting, especially when it relates to our connection, our relationship with really anybody in life, I would say 90% of the time, we have no idea what's actually going on in their brain and all the nuances of how they grew up and their emotion code and all these pieces. I just had this happen the other day with my daughter. I had this story built up and her boyfriend came to me and told me some things, which we can get into at some point. And I was like, oh my God, my stories I've been telling myself for 2 years, they're wrong. I thought she meant this. And underneath it all, she said nothing, but she really was supporting me and had this different view. And it melted me. It wasn't even like a positive versus a negative viewpoint. It was just completely the opposite in a different way that I could have ever thought. And if I had gotten curious,
yes,
at least I maybe would have had some compassion for myself. And I didn't.
But again, that's a key point, and I love that about where you're coming from with the book, is compassion for self. And I think, again, it's one of those things that in our old world, we see that as soft. Are you being soft on yourself? For me, it's got nothing to do with soft for yourself. But talk to us about this, because it ties into what you were mentioning earlier, which is this detached connection. So let's talk about that in the context of others and self, because I think that that's something that our listener is going to have to wrestle with a little bit.
So many philosophers, maybe one of the most famous of our time is Eckhart Tolle, talks about living in the present, right? When I tried to practice this, it felt esoteric. It felt random. Maybe I could do it in meditation. I didn't understand it like living this way. And we talk about we're such a connected world. How do we get disconnected? How do we turn our phones off? How do we pull away? Yes, and how do we do the opposite in our personal life? How do we get so connected, play all out, lean into the hard moments when we want to pull away and we want to run? And you can ask people in my life, I was the first person to be like, this is hard. I'm turning around and running away. Yeah, that's how I showed up versus stepping into curiosity and leaning in and going, oh, that doesn't make sense to me, but I want to hear more. Tell me more. Playing all out in this connected way, but being detached, not caring about the outcome, not trying to control where it goes or having expectations. And I realize what I just said, it is a life journey and it is ridiculously hard. That's my life path. It is how to stay insanely connected, see people, hear them, be curious, allow all possibilities without trying to control which one lands.
I fully agree. That is the journey, to lean into it deeply while being fully letting go of what I want it to be. It's enormously challenging, particularly if you fall into the leadership profile. And by that, I don't mean you have the role. I mean, somewhere in your emotional source code, I've got to lead, I've got to take charge. And so leading and taking charge may have, in all likelihood, previously meant controlling, and it's the exact opposite. In fact, is what causes the exhaustion I talked about at the very beginning, because it's not really service, it's servitude with a large serving of control.
Look, Dov, some of the best companies out there, and I didn't run my companies this way, they create these targets that are based off of possibilities, visions. And I think the ones I ran, which were good enough, they did okay. They create these SMART goals that are so specific, that are so KPI driven, that they completely remove any flexibility. And what I find is that the best way we can show up to life, whether it's work, intimate relationships, families, friends, is to show up as our best self. And today, it may be beautiful, and you're open, and you're loving, and you're whatever. And tomorrow, you may look like shit, and you may not function at a high level, and you may just be surviving. And it was your best. And I find that when we live life with targets, which can still be ambitious and visionary, but we allow ourselves to show up every day, it is so amazing what's actually possible and how that target shifts versus being KPI driven, SMART goals around every single corner. We're not present, we're just checking a box. And that's how I found myself, and a lot of people I know just live by checking a box.
And so let's go to the subtitle of the book, which is The Art of Self Delusion. Tell us what you mean by that in that context of what you've just been talking about.
It's a little tongue-in-cheek in that I found the more I leaned into this concept, for me, when you get present, when you show up to life, that is the first step to being able to actually step into choice, because choice only happens in the present moment. You can't choose something that's already happened, and you can't choose something for the future. I mean, you can once that moment gets here, but it's this present moment we have choice, right? So I found that all of the stories I would weave for myself, I was very rarely actually present. So then it became, oh, what was that experience? And I'd ruminate on it, and I'd tell myself stories. And that's where the self-delusion would come in, because I'd spin things. What's the best thing for me? What would hurt me? What might make me look bad? What do they really mean? And you start playing these games, and they're all delusions. Einstein said it, this world is nothing but an illusion, right? We get to create. We might be looking at each other through this video camera, but what I see in your face and in your background and in your smile that you just had in your face right now, like what that means to me, that's my story. Yours is different. And that's what he meant by that illusion piece. So I just took it a step further to say that ultimately every story we have, it is a delusion, because you might think back on something that happened in your childhood. And your mom, or in my case, my mom, oh my gosh, I look back, you destroyed my childhood. You made me this little helper. I had to be the man of the house. I could put all this big T trauma on it and lament over it for years. Or I could say, you know what? That happened, and my mom didn't know any better, and her dad beat her, and she was doing her best just to protect me. And I can see where she made choices that I don't make with my kids, and she still loved me. How can I hold two opposite truths in my storyline if they're not all delusions? And it's just which one serves us best. Because there is no absolute truth in our interpretation of our experiences.
And I want to push back a little bit on that, because I think that this is also another path of denial that goes on for a lot of people. So the path of denial that goes on for people, aside from, life is great and everything's wonderful, it is the denial of the pain you suffered. And if you deny the pain you suffered, you will repeat that cycle. There's no doubt about that, because I see that every day. And so it's acknowledging that pain and back to having compassion for oneself, because you, we have done shit stuff, because that's the programming we got. And until we can have compassion for that little boy or little girl that we once were and the situation that went on, so you can see that your mom, your dad did these terrible, shitty, traumatizing things, and you can have compassion for the fact that they were just behaving the way they were conditioned. But that doesn't change the fact that the kid in you at that time was very severely wounded and hurt, and that hurt created the play out of destructive behavior. Again, as you said, is holding two worlds. It's the world of, I can have deep compassion for you, mom, dad, whoever, and at the same time, I can have at least equal compassion for the little kid in me who suffered under the pressure of your trauma. Both of those things have to be true.
They do. And just to add one more thing to that, I didn't always believe this, but I'm at a point where I really, really appreciate all of life and how it's happened to me. And why today I don't practice or believe or step into a place of regret ever, because I would not be the man I am, the human I am, if all the things didn't happen in all the ways they did. And while there's deep pain in some of it, there's also deep lessons and beautiful lessons if we allow them in. And this is where we come back to choice, because it's our choice to still be the person we choose to be and not let that define us, because it doesn't have to, because it's still just a story at this point.
And we tell ourselves some pretty interesting stories about what it takes to be a leader, and what it takes to be not only a leader, but particularly a corporate leader, profit leader in an organization. And oftentimes those stories are destructive and not particularly helpful. In part 2 of the show, I want to talk about some of those stories you were telling yourself about being a leader, of course, for the people that you work with and deal with privately, and talk about what it means to pollinate growth and development in individuals versus what the other side of that is, and how we can regain some of our choices and power in situations that seem to be placing us in a place of powerlessness, and how to confront that. So we got a lot to go into part 2 of the show. I want to dig into that. I also want to go into the practicality, Brent. I want to give people some sort of meat and potatoes beyond the philosophy of here's what you can do and what you need to do in order to assist yourself. But before we do that, I want to make sure that people know how they can find out about you, find out about the book that's over your shoulder, and all the other resources that you have with your platform, etc. So please tell us where they can find out more about you.
Yeah, you can get the book on Amazon. It's available in all formats. It's just a great way to dive into my story. It's going to resonate with a lot of driven entrepreneurs, especially those that are parents. And from there, if my work and my story means something to you, you can check out my work at 3xbold.com. Number 3 letter X, bold.com.
Before we go off at the end of part 1 here, what is 3X Bold? What does that stand for?
It's being bold in body, mind, and spirit. It's finding that courageous, authentic, and wild side that's already inside of us and just unlocking it, letting it out.
Beautiful. We're going to be back for more of our delicious conversation with Brent Perkins right after this. You can just simply click and you'll be on to the next episode with Brent. And of course, we'll make sure that we put all the links to all the resources that Brent talked about into the show notes, so they'll be there for you if you didn't catch them. How you're running on a treadmill and you don't have a pen or whatever it might be, and you want to get them, they'll be in the show notes for you. You can find them there. We're going to be back for part 2 of our delicious conversation with Brent Perkins, looking at, are you running some kind of self-delusion? You might want to check that out. Get curious about it, because you might be dying a death of 1,000 paper cuts. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.